All right. Again, want to welcome everyone to the in-service training for agents today on our specialty crop training that we're having today on hops production with Dr. Lockwood and Dr. Smith. And thank everyone for being here and joining us today. This is being recorded. I have had a couple of other agents that couldn't be here today that want to see the recording on this. So we'll make that available to everyone as well. Dr. Lockwood, I'm going to go right with it and turn it to you. And if you need to share your screen, I might need to make you a co-host. So sorry about that. I hadn't done that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I do want to share.
Let me get here and see what I can do. All right, let's see what we can do with that.
Okay, let's see here. Okay. Looks like it's going to work.
All right. Scary since I did it, but maybe it's going to work. Great, it looks good.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Thought we'd talk a little bit about hops production and might put in a plug for the hops bulletin that was put out earlier, and it has most of this information in it. So we'll move along and talk a little bit about some of the things we'll do with hops production. First off, the hop plant is kind of an interesting plant in that the root system is a rhizome and it's perennial, so it'll live for many years, but it produces an annual shoot called the bine, B-I-N-E. It's actually a twining stem that comes from the crown each year. So they'll grow and they'll produce the hops and then die back in the fall. So perennial root, annual top. The hop plant is dioecious. That is, we have both male and female plants. And for hops production, we only want the female plants. So the oils that are produced in the cones of the plant, production is better off the females. And so one of the challenges in producing or buying plants for hops production is to buy from a source that is pretty reliable, that can give you just the female plants. The bines themselves, and you can see the diagrams or the pictures and diagrams around, but the bine is a shoot that grows, as we said, from the rhizome each year, and it will grow up a support system. The string that we generally use in hops production is called a coir, spelled C-O-I-R, and most commonly it's made out of coconut fiber because it will persist throughout the growing season. The bine will actually grow up that and wind itself around the coir in a clockwise direction. And I found that to be kind of interesting, that it's very specific in how it does that. And it will adhere to the coir by structures called trichomes, or little hairs that are on the vine. The growth on the vine is pretty fast early in the year, and you can see as much as 2 foot of growth a week, sort of like kudzu. And the interesting, and we'll talk more about it as we go along, but early part of the growing season, of course, the vine is growing vegetatively. And then on up in the mid part of summer, it'll, as daylight actually starts to shorten, once we hit the summer solstice and days become a little bit shorter, it triggers a change in the plant from vegetative to reproductive growth. So a little bit of terminology, because I could never figure out whether it was hops or hops, and it's both. Hop is the plant, the vine from which hops, the cones, are actually obtained. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see the vines going up the coir on the trellis structure. And that's one of the major things that we encounter in hop production is we've got to get the plant up off the ground, get it up where we've got good sunlight exposure, good air circulation, so that we get some natural disease control. And also, of course, we're going to get better fruiting, our production off it as a result. So the vine needs a support system to grow up the trellis like we see. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. And then the hops actually are ripe, dried pistillate catkin or bloom on the plant that comes about as a result of shortened day length. And if we look at the cone, the hops cones, I'm getting ahead of myself. I talked about the difference about a vine growing up and wrapping around the shoot in a clockwise manner and adhering to that shoot by the use of the trichomes, the little hair-like structures, and compare that to a vine. And terminology gets a little bit tough, but a vine is what we see like on grapevines. It actually produces a tendril, which will wrap itself around the structure and hold it on. So a hop is a vine, whereas a grapevine is a vine. And so it can be a little bit deceiving when we start talking about things. This is a close-up of the cone, and this is what it's all about in hops production. The cone, as we said, is a dried pistillate structure, and it has lupulin glands on it, and those glands are where the oils that contain the alpha acids, beta acids, and so on that the brewers want to use to add character to their products. So it's all about getting a lot of production off of those lupulin glands, and the female hop plant is more productive in that regard than the male. Okay, a little bit about the history. Hops have been around for quite a while. The first recorded incident of hop production in the U.S. goes back in the mid-1600s in the Massachusetts Bay settlement. Supposedly had about 45 acres. And so Massachusetts was the center of hops production in this country for quite a few years. But then gradually New York State took over, and by the mid-1800s, New York was the largest. In the latter part of the 1800s, we started to see a decline in hops production in New York, primarily partly because of disease. Mildews, especially downy mildew, is a real problem with hops, and in the East, we have a lot of pressure from that. That caused a decline. And then as Prohibition came along, of course, the demand for hops was way down. And so we saw a real reduction in hops. When it started back up after the end of Prohibition, it started back in the Northwest. And we were fortunate enough to visit the Yakima Valley, Washington, a few years back and look at hops production. And by looking at things out there, it's easy to see why it moved out there. You're looking at a area that's a high desert, so they don't have much of any rainfall. Their disease pressure is very low. The soils are good, and as we'll find out later on, day length is actually more favorable than here for production of this crop. So in 2017, and Aaron will talk more about this, and so I'm not going to spend much time on it, but the United States actually was a leader in in hop production throughout the world, with almost all of it coming out of the northwestern states, Washington State primarily, and the acreage was increasing a lot due to the microbreweries and increased interest in beers across the world, actually. We also saw a change in the varieties. Primarily in earlier years, the hops that were grown were more alpha varieties. They were bittering agents. None of you are probably old enough to remember Joe Burns, who was our forage specialist for many years, but Joe liked beer. And he always referred to them as bitters, and as many people do, because of the hops contribution. But we started to see a change in around 2015-17, where a lot of the hops that were going in the ground were either for the aroma or as a dual purpose aroma and bittering hop. So we saw a little bit of a change in what the hops were being used for at that time. So I found some recent information on hops production, but basically what it shows is that Washington State is by far the largest hop producing state in the country. And others, Idaho and Oregon, were significant producers, much more so than everybody else combined. We are seeing an increase in the east, but I didn't have any data on that. And this slide just reconfirms what the previous one did to show the acreage. Washington having 5 times more acres than Idaho, which is the #2 producing state. And actually about 72 to 73% of the hop acreage is in Washington State. So in Tennessee, there is a lot of interest in growing hops, and there are some special challenges. So we'd like to run through those quickly. First thing is that we don't have established markets. So hops are not produced to any extent here. And so if you went into production, you'd pretty much need to create your own market. And that is being helped along in that we're seeing the local breweries and are paying a premium for locally grown hops. They would like to be able to say that they were using hops that were grown in that same area, just to give that local flavor to their product. So we do see, even though the markets are not there, there is a demand for a certain amount of local product. The next thing is that we don't have any local information. That is, almost all the information on producing hops comes out of the Pacific Northwest. And there is a dramatic difference, as we saw when we were out there, between weather conditions existing in Tennessee and that in the northwestern part of the country. So not a lot of information that's that's specific to our area. We are seeing more information coming along for the eastern part of the U.S., but Michigan and New York and the northeastern states are where we're seeing most of that. There is some work being done in Virginia, North Carolina, and so we're slowly getting a little bit more information that is applicable to our area. One of the challenges in growing hops is that the ideal place to grow hops is where you have about 15 hours of daylight maximum. And so the further north you go in the summer, the longer the days get. And actually, by the time you get on up to the northern border of the country, that's about the ideal day length. And the reason for that is as day length increases, you stay vegetative. That is, the vines are growing and they're filling up the area on the trellis that you've allocated for them to grow. Once we hit the summer solstice, so about the 21st of June, when the transition from lengthening days to shortening days will trigger a response in the plant from vegetative to reproductive growth. And that's where we see the elongation of the vines will cease, generally because of a terminal bud being set. And then we'll see some lateral shoot production, and the cones will, or blossoms that will develop in the cones will start to form. So day length is a little short in Tennessee, and I'll show you a little bit of information on that in just a bit. And it's amazing to me how just a relatively small difference in day length can make such a difference in plant performance. And so moving on, another thing that kind of challenges us with hops production is our weather conditions. The high rainfall, high humidity levels that we see are ideal for diseases. And we have, as I already mentioned, powdery mildew, downy mildew, and there are some other diseases that we have to contend with. So we've got some special challenges that they don't have, say, in the northwestern part of the country. And our summer heat can also be a negative factor too. When we get excessive temperatures, plant performance is going to suffer as a result. So to grow hops successfully, the majority of the world's hops are grown between 35 degree and 55 degrees latitude in both the northern and southern hemisphere. The closer you are to the 55-degree latitude area, the better off you are because you get better growth and your yields will be substantially higher. We see a photoperiod effect in hops. We need long days for vegetative growth. And then flowering and cone production actually occurs as day length starts to shorten. And I guess you could argue whether it's day length or night length, but whatever. When we hit the middle part of the summer and we start to see decreasing day lengths, that's where we see the transition to from vegetative to reproductive growth. In addition to that, hops have a chilling requirement. So they need a winter temperature below 40 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 to 2 months anyhow to satisfy a requirement in the rhizome that will allow it to break bud and grow normally once weather conditions favor growth. We get that, but if you go much further south in Tennessee, that can be an issue too. Another factor that we look at, and it's not necessarily a problem in Tennessee, but we want to take pains to make sure it's not. We need a lot of moisture in the spring because that plant is growing at such a tremendous rate. And we need a good summer sun and heat, although not excessive heat, to get good growth and development of the chemical compounds once we start to see development of the cones. So if we look at flowering, and again, we see the bines on the left side will grow up until we start to see a shortening of the day length. And the graph in the middle actually is Santa Barbara, California, but it just shows that day length increasing up to about June 2021. And from that point on, it's decreasing. And from that point on, we start to see the flower development and then cone development on the vines. If we don't have good growth to fill up our trellises, our yields are going to be off. And that's one of the things that we've seen in Tennessee and in the areas like Virginia or North Carolina. Our yields are dramatically reduced compared to what we see up in the Northwest. In fact, to the point that our yields are about 25% of what you'll see out of northern hop yards. The hop plant will grow in a lot of different soils. I found it interesting out in the Yakima Valley that they almost considered the hop plant to be a weed. They said it would grow anywhere. Well, it does best in well-drained soils. It will not tolerate wet feet. Deep sandy loam with a pH about 6.5 is best. We need to avoid soils that are fairly heavy or poorly drained because the plant's just not going to perform satisfactorily. Supplemental water and nutrients are recommended to get good controlled growth and cone development. So even though we get a lot of water early in the year, when we talk about growing hops in Tennessee, we're also going to talk about irrigation and having irrigation in and ready to run when we set the planting. To get, and this is repetition, but to produce flowers and high cone yields, we need long days early and then shortening times during the growing season to get the flowering. We need a winter that will give us the chilling. So that's where the range that you see for 40 to 50 degrees latitude comes in for hops production. At the bottom, I put down just a little bit of contrast between Seattle, Washington, and Memphis, Tennessee, as far as the day length. And you notice that there's only about an hour and a half difference in maximum day length between Memphis and Seattle. But that creates a major difference in plant growth in the hop. The vine elongation is not as good. The trellis that they build for hops out in the Northwest will generally be somewhere in the 20, 22 feet in height range, we probably could get by with something in the 16 to 18 feet range, simply because we don't get the vegetative elongation that they see out there. So again, a difference of an hour and a half means difference in plant growth and a tremendous difference in yield. There has been some work done, and this is out of Florida, actually using supplemental light in the hop yard to try to get that vine to fill its area. It'll work, but it also is a substantial expense, and that's something that a lot of the growers say they'd have to look at pretty close to see whether or not it's warranted. If there is a real strong demand for local hops, then that may throw a little bit more favorable light on uh, doing supplemental things like lighting the hop yard. There are quite a few varieties of hops out, and I already mentioned that there are bittering hops, there are aroma hops, and then there's some dual purpose hops. But the one constant thing that I've seen when we've looked at hops, whether it's in the Northwest or the Northeast, or in limited plantings in the Southeast, the variety called Cascade seems to exceed everything else in its performance and yield. And so that, if somebody asks you about a hop variety, Cascade is going to be the number one that'll come to mind, and for me anyhow. You see others like Centennial or Chinook, and the reports that I've gotten have been quite variable. We were in a vineyard or a hop yard, I'm sorry, up in New York State, and looking at varieties up there. Again, Cascade had performed well. In fact, it had performed so well that the prices on that breweries were willing to pay for Cascade were dropping, because there was actually overproduction for the limited number of microbreweries. But they were looking at second varieties like Centennial or Chinook and weeding out some of those simply because they didn't do as well. We'd like to have more than one variety, obviously, so that we could spread out our harvest and also spread out the market demand for the hops. But right now, there is not a lot of work being done on variety evaluation. There are a couple of states in the Southeast that are that have breeders that are looking for varieties that will do well under the sunlight conditions that we see, and that'll fill the trellis, that'll give the yields that we need to make hop production a little bit more attractive. If we look at a timeline for planting the crop, first off, where you plant, just like most every other crop, is one of the most important decisions you make, because it's going to impact how that planting performs throughout its life. Once you've found a good site, then plenty of time needs to be allocated to getting it ready to plant. So looking at pH adjustment, soil nutrient adjustment, getting rid of noxious weeds, building the trellis prior to planting. And the nature of the trellis that we use in hops is a little bit different than, say, in grapevines, where you can actually put the trellis in after the plants have been established. We don't have that luxury with hops production. Having an irrigation system in, trickle irrigation is suggested and operational before you plant, is important, because of the tremendous growth rate that you get on that vine right after bud break. You certainly don't want to be under any lack of moisture conditions. And then the final thing to look at prior to planting is, where are you going to get the plant materials? And there are several sources around. You can buy either rhizomes and plant rhizomes, or you can buy small seedling plants that you can set out. Wherever you go, you want to go to a reputable plant source. You do not want to buy rhizomes, for example, that are virus infected, because that's going to compromise the ability of the planting for yield potential right off the bat. And so in a way, seedling plant production is preferred because you can go to a place that will tissue culture and virus index the plants, and that will eliminate some of the problem. What we'll find though is that some places will favor rhizomes over seedlings because they can get into production a little quicker. And they may use 2 or 3 rhizomes per site when they per planting hole to give better yields early on. Or they may plant more than one seedling plant at the same spot to get a little bit of a jump on yields. Whatever you do, again, getting good quality plant stock is going to be critical for the life of the planting. A good hop yard could be productive for, who knows, 18, 20 years or more, and you certainly don't want to compromise it by having inferior quality plants. So if you look at a site for a hop yard, just like you would say for an orchard, the things that I would look at is you want to have full sun. It's critical for the development of the plant to have that. You would like to have a site that's elevated in regards to the immediate area, so you've got good air drainage. The higher the air drainage, the better frost protection you have, the better disease protection you have. And so you don't want to be in a low area because you're going to have some pretty tough challenges ahead of you as far as keeping the diseases out of the planting. A slightly sloping field is a little bit nicer to work actually from an air drainage standpoint than a flat field, but you don't want to have much of a slope. 2 to 5% is ideal, and it should be a uniform slope. Building a trellis across some of the undulating slopes that you might have is a real nightmare. So that's not something that you want to look at. Also, having a slope that's a little bit steeper than what we've got here is a challenge because you're going to need to be on that field with equipment at times that perhaps is not favorable. That is wet soil conditions and so on. And also harvesting is going to be a real problem. When you're looking at a trellis that might be upwards of 20 feet in height, you don't want to be on too steep a slope. So the soils that we'd look at as ideal would be those that are well drained, such as a sandy loam. We'd say a minimum of rooting for 36 inches rooting depth. The more extensive the root development, the more productive the plants are going to be. You'd like to have medium to high fertility soils because a hop plant does use quite a bit of nutrients, and the pH of 6 to 6.5. If I were establishing a hop yard, I'd like to be at 6.5 to start with. That way it's going to be easier throughout the life of the plant to keep the pH above that 6.0 level. And then irrigation. And I already mentioned that trickle irrigation or drip irrigation, where you're applying the water under the plant as opposed to over the plant, is by far the best because you have less disease pressure. You're putting the water where you want it and not wetting the foliage. And if you develop the trickle system right, you could use fertigation. That is, you could fertigate through that trickle system and maximize the benefits of your fertilizer program. So site preparation, thorough soil testing is going to be critical so you can get the pH adjusted, get the P and K levels up, eliminate noxious weeds. One of the things we find if you're growing hops is that there are very few herbicides and very few pesticides in general that are labeled for use in the hop yard. And so you want to cut down on problems before you establish the planting. We've already talked about air drainage. If you've got a nice field, that is, it's elevated, it's slightly sloping, but if it's got a grown up hedgerow midway through the field or ditch bank, that's a barrier to air drainage. It needs to be eliminated up front. If necessary, on water drainage, if it's a site that otherwise is good, tile drainage may be something to look at. And another thing we do is look at what's growing around the field, because those can be sources of problems, and we could save ourselves some headaches if we took care of some of the potential problem crops around it, or plants around the field, in advance of putting in the hop planting. As far as establishing the planting, rhizomes versus propagated plants, you see rhizomes on the left and the propagated plants on the right-hand side. The nice thing about the propagated plants is that, again, you can get tissue cultured and virus index plants, and it gives you a better shot at going to the field with clean material. If you use rhizomes, you need to make sure that they come from a reputable source, because again, you don't want to plant uh, either the wrong variety or a planting that may have a virus that's going to compromise the performance of that planting throughout its life. Planting time for the seedling plants or the rhizome is going to be late winter to early spring. We can put the rhizomes in earlier because they're going to be not growing, as opposed to the propagated plants, which are going to be vegetative, and you need to put those in after the chance of a late frost is pretty much over. With rhizomes, about a 6 to 8 inch length of the rhizome, and transplanted into the hop yard or put in pots in the greenhouse and grown before it goes to the field can be utilized. But when that hop rhizome is planted, it should be laid down in the trench, the planting hole, horizontally with the bud side up and about 1 to 2 inches below the soil surface, so that it will be protected, but yet won't have a real challenge getting that shoot up above ground level. With softwood cuttings, we can actually take cuttings from the plant and take a piece of stem with 1 or 2 nodes and a couple of leaves, and we can root those things. And in some cases, that's done in the nursery and grown prior to going to the hop yard. As far as trying to grow your own cuttings, it's sort of, in many cases, we find that that's not necessarily the best idea, because not enough attention may be played to growing out that young plant. We're going to focus on the development of the hop plant in the field, because that's where we're getting our income that fall, and we may neglect the plant in the nursery, and if we do that very much, we're not going to get the quality plants we need. So in many cases, you're better off buying good plant stock rather than trying to grow your own. Trellising is a real challenge, and the trellis is going to be the most expensive part of a hop planting, just like it is in, say, in a vineyard. Most hops are trained on tall trellises, and there's been some work done on growing orientation of the bines, which is the best. And the bines are most fruitful if they're grown in a vertical orientation. So that's why the trellises are so high. Out west in the Northwest, they were going on up above 20 feet, upwards of 25 feet in height, and they can fill those trellises. In the East, especially in the Southeast, we're not necessarily going to need that taller trellis, but we also need to have more research done to see just how tall our trellis should be. The trellis needs to be strong. It's going to have a lot of weight on it. So if you look at an individual plant, you're looking at somewhere around 35 pounds, and you're going to have multiple plants with plants every 3 feet or so down the row. So you're going to have a lot of weight on that trellis. It's got to be able to support it. And because it's so high, it also needs to be able to tolerate or resist wind damage. Winds can be a real issue. And so if the posts are too small, if they're not put in the ground right, if they're not anchored right, you could see a trellis go down mid-season. And that's a real disaster, because not only have you lost the trellis, but you've probably lost the crop for that year as well. So with the trellis, the heavy poles that we use throughout need to go in the ground quarter ways, 3 to 4 feet or so, and be anchored well so that they're not going to come over on you. And as mentioned before, they'll go above ground upwards of 20 feet or more. Poles are spaced out generally on the outer rows about every 30 feet. As you move to the inside of a hop yard, quite often they're using greater distances between the poles, but those outer rows are the ones where you really need to have a strong trellis because the winds are going to be worse there. Earth anchors are used to tighten the wires at the end of each row. It's amazing how much tension you can put on a wire and how it will pull a pole. Actually can pull it out of the ground if you don't have it anchored well. So several different types of anchors. I think I've got a slide to show you some of those in just a bit. And then we'll attach strings to the ground near the plant and up to the wire in kind of a V shape. And if you look at this slide, you can see the V shape of the binds as they grow. And we'll let those binds climb those poles. Excuse me. So each year we have to retrain the binds because as we said earlier, the binds are annual. They die back to the ground if we don't cut them back. And quite often as we harvest the cones, we're cutting the binds off down near ground level and taking them out of the field. But the binds have to be trained every year. So quite often when in the spring of the year, the binds will start to grow and we'll get new binds growing, and then they go in and cut them off and start it all over again. Reason they do that is that first flush of bind growth quite often is kind of irregular. And so by going in and cutting everything back and starting them over, you get more uniform growth. And that means that the operations like tying and eventually on up into harvest will be more concentrated. It's not going to spread out the problems that you could come into, say, with harvest or just securing the binds if you have differences in growth rates. Generally, a couple binds are going to be trained up each support string on the trellis, and that'll vary a little bit with the age of the planting and the growth that you see in a planting. So after the planting has been established for a couple years, the rhizomes get bigger each year, and the rhizomes provide the energy for that first flush of growth with the binds. They'll support more binds as the planting gets a little older. With I mentioned cutting back shoots, and this is something that we do every year to kind of control bind growth and also harvest time and help reduce disease issues through that. It's important to get good air drainage in the planting. And so quite often, and this will be, I think, especially important for us in our disease control situation. Once the binds get up about 6 feet or so in height, it's advisable to go in and strip the leaves and lateral shoots off the lower part of the binds so that you've got better air circulation throughout the planting. Failure to do that could give you a lot more disease pressure with things like mildew. Irrigation, again, is even in an area that has 50+ inches of rainfall in a year, it's not spread out right for the crops. So we need to be able to provide supplemental water when the plant needs it to get the best growth and fruiting. So irrigation can improve both yields and quality of the crops, and it may positively affect the alpha acid concentration. So we need to be able to irrigate if the plant's stressed. Normally, we look at hops needing about 27 to 32 inches of water during the growing season, but there are critical times when you certainly don't want to be limited. And that's in the spring as the hop plant starts to grow. We need to make sure that water's not limiting. And then on up in just before flower initiation, we don't want to be under any kind of water stress. So about 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week is what we look at. And we need to be able to supplement that if we don't get it normally. The first year with the hop planting, we don't need that much water, but we water more frequently because we don't have the established root system or as extensive a root system as an older planting will have. So we water more frequently, but at lesser amounts. Fertilization, first off, just like other crops, we don't want to base our fertilizer rates on soil test results because the correlation between that and what's in the plant is not real good. But we do want to continue to soil test to monitor soil pH for nutrient availability. And then we may be looking at tissue testing as a way to find out what's actually in the plant. And that's something that if a grower goes to the expense of putting up building a hop yard and putting in a good planting, tissue testing is a very good tool. I think it's an essential tool to monitor that nutritional status to get the best performance out of the planting. We do have some disease and insect problems, and there is some information out there. There is a hop pocket pest guide pictured here that Vermont put together. Vermont's a long ways away, but they have some of the same problems, although some of ours will be more intense than what they see. And over time, we're developing more of this information that's more specific to southeastern conditions. Japanese beetles will affect hops both on the leaves and on the cones. We do have cutworms that can cut off that young vine as it starts to grow. So we need to keep an eye on the planting and be prepared to take measures if the problem should show up. With diseases, we anticipate that diseases will be a problem, and therefore a preventive spray program is going to be essential. On insects, most of our programs are going to be reactive. That is, once we see a problem starting to show with insects, then we're going to take steps to address it. This just shows powdery mildew and downy mildew on hops can affect the foliage. It can also affect the cones. And of course, it can be devastating because without the leaf area, the cones are not going to develop well. But if you get the mildew on the cones itself, then they're not going to be usable by the brewers. Harvest is kind of a problem, and Lee and I visited a hop planting in Knox County this fall, and the manager of the farm was new, and he said, "When do you harvest hops?" And actually, we told him, "Well, next week you need to be ready to harvest." And then, what do you do with them? Well, ideally you have your market set up ahead of time, but this was a new venture for him, and he had a crash course in hop production. Fortunately, he's got a good person to work with in Lee to kind of help him through that. But variety and management are dependent on where you are. Generally, we look at mid-August through late September in Michigan, which means that we're going to be a good bit earlier here. We may be late July up into August. The harvest date is going to be variable depending on variety. We'll look at cone moisture content and weather, disease, and pest issues. One of the things about harvest is when you get there, time is really critical. Hops are in prime condition for harvest for a short period of time, like a week to a week and a half. And so you don't want to harvest too early. It'll cost you yields and flavor, and could cost you some marketing issues and reduce yield on down the road. Harvesting too late, you get a reduced aroma quality, a reduced brewing quality. You could get shattering of the cones, and your yields will go down, and discoloration will lessen the value of the hops for the brewers. How you harvest depends a lot on the size of the planting you have. There are some very sophisticated harvesters out there, but a lot of the small plantings, the hops are harvested where the bines are cut and the cones are physically or manually removed from the bines, or in some cases the cones are actually removed in the field without cutting down the bines. That's a slow process, and I might point out that the bines, or the trichomes on the bines, can be irritating, and therefore we suggest that if you're going to work with them, you wear gloves. The drying process can have an impact on the timing and speed of harvest. The better dryer you have, the longer you can wait to pick something to harvest the hops. And then, if weather conditions are a little adverse, you can dry them down ideally if you've got the equipment that'll do it. So you have to look at your ability to harvest and to dry down and when you refine your time of harvest. You want to make sure you got enough time to strip and clean the cones. And again, it goes back to how big is your hop yard. How many hop yards are in your area may also be something to consider, because there may be some commercial operations that could help in stripping or processing the cones once you get them off. The essential oil content of the hop cone continues to increase beyond the regular harvest date. And so you can see that beers that are made with a single variety of hops can have different flavors that will be based on harvest date. And that's a brewer decision that you want to work closely with the brewers in that harvest time. So the two methods of timing the harvest, the subjective and the objective. The subjective method is just with experience. You can look and you can feel and you can smell the sensories perception. So as the cones mature, you'll see a color change from green to a yellowish green to more yellow. The leaves become almost papery to the touch, and they may have a little bit of brown right on the outer edge. And then you can see a yellowing of the lupulin glands in the cone. Those are things that experience will help as far as refining the time of harvest. You can pick up a change in aroma. So if you take some cones and rub them in between your hands and sniff, you can see a difference in the smell. Immature hops quite often will have a green grass or hay-like smell, whereas over mature hops will be more like onion, sulfur, or garlic. So, it's sort of like what, well, any grower with 20 years experience can maybe tell you exactly when by sensory. It's something you develop with time. You're not going to know it right off the bat. Also, a cone that you crush by hand will stay compressed when the pressure is removed and it leaves behind a sticky residue. And that's going to be another factor you look at that will help you decide when to harvest. As far as the objective method, realizing again that the hops are only in prime condition for just a week and a half, look at the percent dry matter to green weight, and that would involve pulling cones, weighing them and drying them down and re-weighing them. Ideally, we're looking at dry matter somewhere around 20-23%, depending on variety and weather conditions and the initial moisture content of the cones, and also whether there's any insect or disease pressure. That's going to impact harvest as well. A combination of dry matter and sensory evaluation is the best. So you will refine it over time, but that is something that a new grower is going to have to learn. There is a use for hops without drying them, and that may be a real advantage for local harvest. That is, a wet hop can be used immediately to brew seasonal ales. And there's not, you're not going to see wet hops imported from much distance because the hops are going to start to go down. They're going to rot in transit. So you generally, you want to have if a person's going to use wet hops, they want a local source where they can get the hops within 2 days of harvest, or the ability to seal the hops and refrigerate, not freeze. And they have a little bit more time. Dried hops can be marketed over a lot longer period of time, and they can be vacuum packed and stored in the freezer for later use. So drying, depending on the size of the hop yard, can be anything from a microwave oven up to a regular oven or big dryers. Generally, we want to dry at a relatively low temperature, below 140 degrees, to get the best quality. And we dry down to 8 to 10% moisture to keep molding or other spoilage, and then store them in a vacuum sealed package and under freezer conditions so they continue to have the quality. Hops can, the cones on hops can be used as a cone, or they can be processed. And what we see in this picture are hops that are dried down and then pelletized. And actually, this is the way a lot of the microbreweries like to use hops, because they don't have to handle as much volume. Although there are some that will use the entire cone, but this just shows pelletizing of the hops. So that's kind of it on production in a nutshell. Again, we have a lot of unanswered questions on hop production in Tennessee, but we are learning. And if a local market is willing to pay a premium for local hops, there may be an opportunity. We're not going to be head-to-head competitors for somebody like Washington State, simply because our yields are going to be so low and our cost of production is going to be high. But with that, I'm going to stop and let Aaron take over. If you've got any questions, I'll look forward to answering them later on.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Lockwood. If you'll stop sharing your screen, I think I've got it where Aaron can go ahead with his. Appreciate that information that you shared with us this morning.
All right, Troy,
So,
can
Aaron,
you see my screen and hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'll get going here. I mean, I will say it is a fascinating plant to grow. I actually grew two different varieties this past year. So I grew a Cascade and a Chinook. Got the rhizomes from Great Lake hops. We harvested them that first week in August, and just from our two little rhizomes there, we got about 3/4 of a pound dried down for each. And so it is an interesting one. There's a lot of challenges with growing it, and I'd be happy to share kind of that kind of, I guess, backyard garden type variety or process as well. But I'm going to speak a little bit more kind of about the hops production, economics, and marketing more from a commercially viable scale. As Dr. Lockwood mentioned, we're not going to compete with Washington. It is much more of a niche market where you're working and partnering with a local brewery. So, just some brief producer considerations if you're looking at entering this market to make some money. The first one is, do you have a market? You have to have a market before you grow. What varieties should be grown? How many acres or plants are you looking at doing? Do you have a suitable site? Site selection is very important to help minimize disease pressure and make sure that you're going to get as high yield as possible. Do you have sufficient labor and capital? It can be a very labor intensive commodity to produce. And when you look at kind of the trade-offs between labor and capital, it can be challenging since we don't have the infrastructure or the equipment readily available. It requires a lot more labor than they would in some other areas where you've got mechanization. You have a harvest, pelletizing, processing, storage, and marketing plan. There's a challenge with growing it for sure, but so much of it happens after the harvest. And it's incredibly important to kind of look at your different options. And then what are your cost of production, price, yield, and revenue expectations? It can be a challenging crop to produce profitably in this area. And we'll go through kind of some of the expectations out there. So just kind of a quick industry overview. There's about 60,000 acres, as Dr. Lockwood mentioned. The vast majority of that is in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. But we are seeing acreage creep into certain places. So Michigan, 700 acres, New York, 400 acres, North Carolina, 25, Virginia, 20, and Kentucky, 18. Tennessee I wasn't able to find any data on what we're currently growing in Tennessee, but I'm not aware of any hop yards that are of a substantial size. There's a lot that are kind of, a quarter of an acre, half an acre type things, or just a few plants. And so again, those south and mid-south yields are highly uncertain, and variety selection will partially dictate that yield. So in terms of U.S. hop acreage, a lot of this correlates with some of the things that we're seeing in the craft brewing industry, where we are seeing, greater demand by craft brewers who use more hops in some of their production. And again, when we look at kind of Tennessee compared to where the U.S. Yield is in particular, average yield of 1,924 pounds per acre, we're substantially lower than that. Dr. Lockwood is right. We're around a quarter to a third of that is what we've seen. It's not to say that we wouldn't be able to bump that up a little bit, but the first thing to recognize going into this industry is that we're going to have lower yield prospects than what we would for other primary growing areas in the U.S. When we look at production, as I mentioned, it's going up, and a lot of that is being driven by the craft beer segment. Variety selection is one that's really important. Pretty much all the hops varieties out there, the vast majority of them are developed for Pacific Northwest conditions. Cascade is one that's been a kind of a mainstay, but there's a tremendous number of new varieties that are proprietary that are being developed over time. All of them are a little bit different in terms of what their characteristics or their aromas, what their acid or what their alpha acid profile is. And so again, there's a lot of variation in this. And so one of the ones that's really important, and this goes to understanding where you're going to sell them in the market, is to understand what craft breweries are looking for. One of the other big challenges that there is in that market is a lot of craft breweries are looking for something new, something unique. And so again, looking at kind of a 20-year repayment on a hop yard, you're probably looking at having to swap out some of your varieties more frequently than that, even if your trellis system and some of your infrastructure is able to hold over time. And so just to give you an idea of the diversity of the different varieties that are out here, Cascade was the dominant one for a long time. It's kind of fallen back. You can see just the sheer number of varieties. There's over 80 brands and varieties in the US alone. And so again, one thing that is challenging when we went to that trip out in Washington, a lot of these new varieties being developed are proprietary. And so again, we don't have great data on it. There are still some mainstays like Cascade, Centennial, and Chinook, but all these ones with the little trademark on them, they are the ones that have been developed recently and are really gaining market share. And so when we look at kind of the demand for hops, the increased demand is tied to the growth of craft beer. Obviously, craft breweries are extracting a price premium relative to traditional breweries like Budweiser and Coors. And they're interested in those unique or something new. They're trying to end up building a flavor profile that maybe isn't out there in terms of more traditional brewing companies. There is limited other uses for hops that can be used in some ornamental capacity and in some food flavor additives. But again, we're talking about a very small amount that is potentially ended up using for that. So, local demand varies, but, the work that we've done on the survey side of things does indicate that there's a willingness to pay a price premium for local production. Part of that is developing that story that is important to some of these craft breweries to end up saying, okay, we've got some of our product from Tennessee sources and supporting kind of local agriculture. When we're looking at hopping rates for craft beer versus a typical beer, they're much higher. So again, that's why we're seeing a lot of these new varieties develop, is there's demand for those new varieties that are out there, and they're using more of them than, say, Budweiser or Coors Light. So when we look at this, this is one of the ones that's kind of challenging to wrap your head around, is when you look at the different amounts of hops that would be used to brew a keg of beer. And so again, it goes anything from the Imperial IPA, where you're talking 3.8 pounds, down to an amber where it's 0.17 pounds. So it does matter what breweries are brewing. The brewery that you're working with, in terms of what their product line looks like, as to what potential amounts are. Now, the other thing to recognize is, given the vast diversity of hops and the different characteristics that they're looking for, most of these, even these small craft breweries, are sourcing hops from all over the US and all over the globe, because they're looking for very distinct flavor profiles. And so when they're purchasing them, they're bringing them in from multiple places. So even if you can just get a small portion of that with a local hop yard, that would be something to end up looking at. When we look at craft breweries, this is kind of an idea of how this industry is growing. Right now, there's over 8,800 breweries in the US, gained over 380 in 2020. That's net, because we have seen some, changes in kind of the trajectory of craft breweries. Yes, we're still getting rapid expansion of that industry, but we are starting to see an increase in the number that are exiting as well. And so again, we're not sure if that's going to be just a COVID-19 related issue, but it is something to continue to look at. Where do we reach market saturation, and when do we see a fallback of some of the craft breweries that potentially end up exiting? When we look at Tennessee specific, these numbers from Cal Hensley just a couple of months ago, we have 122 in Tennessee, ranked 23rd in 2020. We have a growth of 400% over the last 10 years, where in 2011 we only had 24. And obviously it's concentrated in kind of our metro areas. So Knoxville, Nashville, Memphis, the Tri-City area is where we're starting to see a lot of these craft breweries. As I mentioned, they use hops from kind of all over the world. So when we talk about craft breweries, one of the challenges is they're not all the same, right? They have different products, they have different services. So they can fall into kind of a bunch of different category breweries, and then restaurants with bars as well, and then tap rooms. When we look at kind of sales, just to give you an idea of the size of the industry, it's pretty well diversified in Tennessee, where we've got a lot of small breweries, a whole bunch of medium-sized, and a few larger craft breweries that are producing in the state. One thing that is kind of unanimous across the size of breweries is how much you expect your sales to increase over the next 5 years. You can see the vast majority of them are assuming that their sales are going to increase by 25%. Or greater. That's 56% of respondents to our survey. So again, there is growth in this industry. It does provide opportunities to get some local product in there. Just to kind of give, this is the only slide I'm going to talk about in terms of internationally, but you can see Germany and the United States are the two dominant growers and exporters of hops, making up about 70% of the export market, whereas those that are importing hops is all over. Now, as Dr. Lockwood ended up saying, it's unlikely that we're going to be competing for international markets in Tennessee. But again, it is something to have an understanding of where hops are produced, who's importing them, and where they're being utilized. So the first one that I want to kind of dive right into is prices and marketing. There's lots of different marketing options that you can end up looking at. A lot of it depends on the size and the scale of the potential hop yard that you're looking at putting in. So one of the challenges is there is no established market price in Tennessee, and the product is very heterogeneous. Variety, quality, and local production, all factors that go into what the price you would potentially be able to end up obtaining. So it's really important to work with a brewer to determine the characteristics, preferences, and varieties that they are looking for. And the other one is growing it is only part of the battle. There is a substantial amount of time that does need to be designated to market that product if this is going to end up being economically viable. So when we look at kind of national hop prices, there is not a way in Tennessee right now to have the national average price with the production that we have and be profitable, as far as I can tell. Now, some people may be able to get a little bit more competitive, but it's very important to be able to get that price premium for a local product, locally produced product, that is being used by craft brewers. So this graph shows the national average price, and it's actually at an all-time high of almost $6 per pound. But when we're looking at marketplaces like the Lockwood and Exchange is a good one to look at, in terms of, you can look at different varieties, different prices for those varieties, and they range tremendously, right? And so you can go on there and you can look and see what's available within state areas. There wasn't any on there for sale in Tennessee, but there were some from Virginia and North Carolina. And just to give you the diversity of the price range, right? You're looking at something like Cascade, $4.20 to $13.12, Chinook $6.40 to $13, Amarillo $10 to $17. So when we start looking at these, if we can extract that high end of that price premium, or that high end of that price level, all of a sudden it does start to look like we can maybe do something economical there, even with the reduced yields, as long as we end up having a reasonable input cost structure, which I'll talk a little bit about closer to the end of the presentation. This is the Lockwood and Exchange for those that are interested at looking at market prices for hops. I think it's an excellent resource that allows you to end up looking at, if you want to sell, the package, the size, the different characteristics, to end up having an idea of the geographic location, the shipping, and then again, you can look and see all the varieties, all the listings, all the years. Some of these are going to be stored for multiple years. Other ones are going to be fresh, produced within the current production year. So when we look at other marketing opportunities, there are some other opportunities that are available to generate side income. So when we look at partnerships with craft breweries, having a field type day, working with home brewers is another one that, it's difficult to get good data on the size and scope of the home brewing market, because so many of those sales occur online. So that's another one that is a possible way to end up further marketing this product. Agritourism was a big one when we went up to New York and toured around the Finger Lakes. The hop yards that they had up there, they're quite picturesque. They usually put them in a very nice location. They were able to have functions like weddings and corporate functions that did generate additional money in addition to the hops and the brewery that was on site. And then looking at some cooperatives or machinery cost shares. There are companies out in North Carolina and Virginia that have played around with different types of harvesting equipment that may alleviate some of the labor requirements, and being able to potentially work with other growers in the region to end up spreading out some of those fixed costs can be beneficial. So before I jump into kind of the cost of production and revenue expectation side of things, the one thing that I will point out is this is evolving very quickly on the economic side of things. And there's a tremendous amount of variation in costs and revenue expectations for Tennessee producers. So it's really difficult to find a kind of a standardized economic model that we can pre-populate some of these numbers. Now, what I hope that you'll get from this is kind of the different categories that are necessary to look at and to quantify the costs that are going to be affiliated with any operations that you're working with. And so one of the resources that I found is North Carolina State came up with a really nice little spreadsheet that you can easily modify. And so I'm going to kind of step through on the different categories. And so again, the one thing that's so challenging right now is a lot of our hop yards really vary in size. And so the standard that I'm going to use is going to be a 1/4 acre. And again, that doesn't maybe sound all that much, but I'm not aware of too many hop yards in the state that are bigger than that. So again, you're talking about very different sizes of production relative to other regions, such as the Pacific Northwest. And so here we have this one, I believe was in New York, that we went and visited, and then you can see the Yakima Valley where you're talking hundreds of acres, very different systems. This is my little home hop yard. And again, it's just the two different rhizomes that I ended up growing, but it was remarkable to watch it grow. It grew, anywhere between an inch to 3 inches a week. We planted in May, and it got up over 20 feet tall for both of them, and there wasn't too much of a variety difference in there. So one of the things that really did work quite well, just as kind of an FYI, is, you know, if you want to make sure that it gets a lot of sunlight, but also having that wind to try to keep some of that moisture off of it, I think really did wonders in terms of making sure that we didn't have a lot of disease issues. So I look at kind of that 1/4 acre hop yard. The first one is land preparation. Obviously, when we're talking about land preparation, this is much easier to end up accomplishing before you put the trellis system in there. So you want to make sure that you're making sure that the soil is in the condition you want it before you end up planting or putting in any of the trellis systems. So making sure that the pH is correct, know where your fertility is, and then end up having the land prepared before you end up putting in that trellis system. And so again, looking at the different costs, you want to look at kind of what is that cultivation, what is the fertilizer, what is the lime, what is the prices that you're end up looking for preparing that land for building the trellis system. Next one is the trellis construction, and again, there's numerous different designs that hop publication that UT put out 2 years ago. It has kind of some different configurations. We just took a standard configuration from this North Carolina state budget, but you can kind of go through and look and see all the different cables and poles and clamps that you end up needing in order to build the budget for what the cost would be to build this. And so one of the things that I do really like about this template is it gives you that total cost, provides an estimated useful life, and then it annualizes that cost. So you can really see, you know, what you have in your hop yard in terms of total cost of production or total cost, and then what it is, the annualized cost in addition to any production expenses you'd have, to end up understanding what your total annualized cost of production is, so you can compare it to your revenue potential based on what your yield and price assumptions are, which I think is really important to understand. Where are we profitable? Where are we not profitable at when we're building this? When we look at planting, you know, obviously we have rhizomes and mulch. Mulch we're going to be doing on an annual basis. I did mention earlier that I think that in a lot of these cases, I think 15 years, yes, the plants are viable for that long, but with how rapidly a lot of these craft breweries are looking for new product lines, new varieties, I'm not necessarily sure from a marketing standpoint that it is going to be that long term. Again, that's the discussion that you need to have with craft breweries that are potentially buying the hops. When we look at irrigation, yes, we get lots of water in Tennessee, but we want to make sure that we have that consistent supply. So, you know, getting an estimate of what it costs to put in an irrigation system on a 1/4 acre plot. Some of these prices have probably come up a little bit with the rising cost of everything, it seems, over the last year or so. So again, we have to double check on availability and make sure that current prices are reflected in any budget estimates. When we look at labor, this is one of those ones where it's incredibly important to understand what resources are available to the hop yard. Where is labor constrained? Where is labor abundant? Is there anything that we can use in terms of mechanization to reduce or eliminate labor for certain components? But again, there's some of these, particularly on a small scale, it's just going to take a lot of manual labor to end up getting a lot of these functions done. It's just one of the necessary costs for growing hops in Tennessee. So we kind of look at establishment costs. This is the summary for that 1/4 acre hop yard that we put there. About $6,500. I'm sure there is a wide variety depending on the construction materials you use for your trellis, you know, what irrigation system you're using, and then what your labor rates are in terms of who's doing a lot of the labor. But again, it's a ballpark estimate of what we're looking at. If you annualize that based on the useful life of each one of the components in those individual spreadsheets, what you come up with is about $510 per year is what you're looking at trying to end up recouping off of the fixed costs on that. When we look at operating, Dr. Lockwood stepped through a lot of this, but we have the twine or the core, fertilizer, and then different herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, tissue analysis. Dr. Lockwood mentioned that in terms of making sure plants have adequate nutrition, annual mulch, and then fuel, lime, and additional lab testing. We look at production labor. This is where we'll get a lot of our costs. This is excluding the harvest, but again, it gives you an idea of the amount of time that's required in terms of physical labor to end up producing a 1/4 acre of hops. Even though the trellis and irrigation systems, there's a one-time establishment cost, we do have to make sure that we are accounting for the cost to maintain those two systems. So flushing lines, doing repairs, replacing emitters, and then, you know, repairing the trellis to make sure that each year it is operational, because we'll cut down those plants, restring them. We want to make sure that we don't have the trellis fall over or have any issues during the growing season. When we look at harvest labor, this is one of the hop yards we visited up in New York. And again, there's numerous different ways to end up harvesting hops. There's the machine harvester, the large machine harvesters that basically run right down the rows, or you have operations like this where you are hand cutting and then you're running them through some type of deconer. The other way to do it is hand pick those hops, which I have seen up in the Tri-City area, but that is incredibly labor intensive. So again, you know, finding that balance between mechanization and physical labor is very important. But again, you're looking at a substantial amount of labor just to do a 1/4 acre of hops, to make sure that you can end up having, you know, sufficient people or man hours to end up accomplishing your task. When we grew ours, what we ended up doing is we relied on neighbors. Neighbors probably thought I was a little bit crazy, but we cut them down and we had kind of a neighborhood pick party. And then we did a wet hop beer, which seemed to make everybody somewhat happy a week or so after the hop picking. When we looked at fixed costs, again, you have that annualized cost of establishment. Then you have any taxes, insurance, land charges, and overhead, trying to account for all the costs, both on the establishment side and then on the operating side, to make sure that we get a true idea of what our total costs are. So when you look at other costs, and this is one where it gets even more challenging, is drying and pelletizing. You know, it's a challenge to end up having that type of infrastructure. There are different home drying units that you can end up having. And then when you look at labeling, packaging, and storage, one of the ones that I've seen some people end up using is to end up having just the loose leaf packages. Pelletizing is what a lot of the brewers are looking for, but the key is to end up getting it dry, you know, getting the oxygen out of there, and then making sure that it is not getting sunlight on it as well, and keeping it stored in cold storage, and then distributing it after that. And then marketing and contracting, you know, there's a lot of hops where if you are talking to breweries, they will quite often say, yes, we will take anything that you can grow. The one caveat that we've seen with that is if you aren't able to achieve the quality of hops that they're looking for, then it becomes somewhat problematic. And if you are doing your own packaging and doing online sales, you know, shipping expenses can be a substantial cost as well. So we look at just kind of a cost of production summary for that 1/4 acre hop yard. The total establishment cost was $6,500 for a 1/4 acre. So the total annualized cost, that includes the annualized cost of establishment, is $3,363. If you look at a revenue potential, and again, this is where the yield uncertainty and price uncertainty creeps into the equation. If you have 300 pounds on a 1/4 acre, so that's 1,200 pounds per acre. So, you know, about half of what we're looking at, a little more than half of what we're looking at in terms of national average, but we're extracting a price premium. We're still a little shy on where we are in terms of covering our costs. So again, there's a huge variation in these establishment and annual costs based on the different systems that we're running. And then looking at the labor cost is the big one relative to capital costs. So the big question is, we do need to end up having a price premium to offset these lower yields. So when we look at kind of the take-home message, this is the last slide I'll share with everybody today, is we really need to have an understanding. So doing a quick sensitivity analysis on what yields and prices need to be extracted in order to be profitable, I think is essential. So when you come up with your cost of production, I just rounded that number up to $3,400. You can see if we have low yields, there's not a lot of scenarios where we can get profit out of these hop yards. Now, if we can extract that substantial price premium and get average or above average yields for our region, then there might be the possibility to get some profit out of a small scale hop yard if you're able to get that price premium. So again, when you're looking at this from a profitability standpoint, it's really important to be able to really quantify what those establishment costs are, and then what the annual cost of production is. Have an understanding of what your yield potential is for the varieties that you're growing, and then really have an idea of what the potential price premium is for the hops that you're growing. If you think back to that price slide that I showed at the beginning for the national average, it was an all-time high, and it was at $6. And so even based on if we're getting that market price of $6, and this would be 2,000 pounds per acre, because this is for a quarter acre, we're still not in a profitable level where we're at in Tennessee. And so again, to me, the two biggest factors is, can you get that price premium, and what is your cost of production going to end up being? So with that, and if you're interested in these, I have the spreadsheets available for anybody that wants to kind of run some of the numbers and look at some of the variability in terms of returns. So with that, I would be open to any questions, and I appreciate everybody taking their time to be with us today.
Dr. Smith, thank you again. Thank you for that. We will open it up for any questions anybody might have for Dr. Lockwood or Dr. Smith, either one at this time. If you just unmute and let us know what your question might be. We did have some comments in the chat. We appreciate those. Lee, about how wet Knoxville has been over the last few years, and then Amanda with some of the things that she toured and saw this past June up north in some of the yards. And if I cut somebody off, I apologize. Thought I might have heard somebody. Any questions from anyone? Quiet group right now. Dr. Lockwood, thanks for let me know hop or hops. As I've written emails, I've never known which way to put it. So I must have gotten it right somewhere along the line, because I did both, no matter what I might have said or did there. We appreciate them. Great information, lots of things in there, and we do appreciate that. While we got just one other minute or two, I'm going to let Rachel have a free advertisement here if she would like. So I'm gonna call her for just a minute. And then if you've still got anybody thinks of a question while she's talking, we'll come back to that, and then we'll dismiss right after that. Rachel.
Hey, thanks, Troy. Yes, I know many of you are already planning on being here, but if you know of anyone else that might be interested, please tell them about our Tennessee Farm and Ferment meeting on January 4th. It is here at the Rutherford County office. And I know Dr. Smith will be speaking a lot throughout the day. And hopefully Dr. Lockwood will be able to join us kind of later on in the day from Kentucky. But again, please share that with anyone that you think might be interested. We really need some more extension presence there. So if you are available, please come. I think it'll be really important for you to meet the craft beverage industry individuals in your county and help them connect with some of our local farmers. So whether it's somebody growing hops or barley, or they're interested in that, or cattle farmers using spent grain, anything of the sort would be helpful. And even if you know a brewer or distiller or winemaker in your area, please invite them as well. You have this flyer in your email. And if you can't find that, please contact me and I'd be happy to send it to you again. And you can print those off and have them in your office or put it on your social media accounts. TDA posted it on social media last week. So you can go and find that, and please share that on your county extension website or county extension Facebook page. Again, January 4th, here at Rutherford County, called Tennessee Form and Ferment. Hopefully you have that in your email. And I know Kevin Rose said he was going to have to change a meeting to come. So hopefully you made that happen, Kevin.
Nothing like getting caught out on Zoom, is it, Mr. Rose?
Absolutely.
Thanks, Rachel. Again, if you have an interest in a county or area meeting on the subject of hops and or tree nuts, let me know about that for late February up till early part of April. We'll try to schedule that as in person for producers in counties. Our next training on this line of specialty crops is going to be on vegetables on Tuesday, November the 23rd at 9 a.m. If you hadn't signed up for that in Super, please do so. Last call for questions.
I do have one for Dr. Lockwood, actually. I would just be interested to know how many acres do you think we have in Tennessee, and what's the largest hop yard that you're aware of that is currently operating in this state?
You know, I really don't have a clue on that, Aaron. I've only visited, well, one in Knox County with Lee, and I've talked with some people that have got small plantings around the state, but I'm not aware of over probably 3-4 acres total. And I know there's one Knox Hops that in Knox County that I wasn't aware of whether it was still in operation. It is. I found out this past Saturday, but I haven't had an opportunity to see it. So I really don't have an answer to your question.
Yeah, it's a challenging one to try to get information as to what we've got within the state. So.
Anything else from anyone? Dr. Lockwood, appreciate your time. Thank you for all the information you brought to us. Dr. Smith as well. In a sense, it's a challenging kind of a crop right now for everyone, but appreciate those insights. Appreciate the interest agents had in being on here with the call this morning as well. I know you all got bunch of things to do. Thank you for being with us this morning. Again, hope to see a lot of you on November the 23rd. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you.